Hey there, grab a cup of coffee and join us in an entertaining and thoughtful conversation about parenting. We're tasting new coffee every episode and diving into a deep conversation about the inevitable speed bumps and seasons we'll encounter as we strive to be the most successful parents and spouses we can be. Welcome to Family Brew Podcast.
And so what are we drinking?
We are drinking Jim Beam Bourbon Vanilla flavored ground coffee.
Similar to every other vanilla-y coffee I've smelled before.
Oh, your face is totally confidence-inducing.
No.
I would have to try a larger sip, but
Ooh,
it's pretty hot.
Strong. That is hot.
I like it.
She probably has the good cup for this one.
This is the least expensive coffee we've ever tasted. I can tell you that for sure because it came from the dollar store.
Oh, for
but
real?
it's also a pretty small amount. It's only 4 ounces, but
$3.99.
yeah.
Man, that really is
it.
hot.
I mean, coffee from the dollar store just sounds wrong.
I think this is better than the one we tried last episode.
Really?
This is probably a... What did I say last one, 2?
2.
This is a stronger 2. It's not a 3.
Plus.
It's not a 3.
2+.
2+. Yeah,
I'm
speaking
hot.
of plus,
I
we're
went
going to
with
talk
4.
about...
I like
Why
it.
is it so hot this
We're
time?
going to talk
Really
about...
good.
Yeah. I'm going to say solid 2.
What do you think?
I don't understand what...
Well, I think I gave the last one a 1. I'll give this one a 1+.
I
Jamie's
promise
like,
I'm not
what
making it weird. I'm doing exactly the same ratio of coffee we normally do. So
That is
it's in a French press.
not good.
Drinking it out of these Costa Brewhouse cups. And I'm not a big fan of this one.
I'm
I
going to
like
rate that
it.
a 0.
For real?
Oh,
Worse
yeah.
than the last one?
Wow.
Yeah, that
The
is.
last one tasted like
The last
creamy
one-
water.
Yeah, this
I'm
one
gonna be
tastes
the
like
outlier.
nasty.
I'm gonna
You
go with
stand-
I'm gonna go with a solid 3, maybe a 4.
No, stop.
I like it.
Get serious.
Okay, I'll give it
Pivot.
a 2.
Yeah.
I'll give it a 2.
You
because
guys
of-
all did the creamer wrong. That's probably
Oh,
why.
yeah, that's
No,
definitely
this-
the issue.
I did the creamer better on this one than the last one.
All our creamer is sugar and cream. That's
Right,
it.
and more of it makes things taste better. At church on Sunday, the pastor said something that kind of got me thinking and kind of, I think it's going to push us into a topic today. But he said one of the biggest lies that we tell our kids is that they can be anything they want. And so his example of that was that he always wanted to play in the NBA, but it just happened to be that he was like short and unskilled, right? And so when people tell you that you can be anything you want, he talked about that being dishonest with our kids. And so and most of you guys know this, but in high school, I went to what do they call it? Like a recruitment, like a job fair that the high school had. And I spent a long time talking to the Air Force recruiter, and I went further than that and took a test to join the Air Force. And at some point during the process, I was told that I was too tall to be a pilot. And I looked it up today, and they've actually relaxed those standards. I don't know if recruitment is
military
down.
has relaxed everything.
Recruitment is down, but and so I opted out. And at this point, I still probably have some regrets that I just didn't go into the Air Force and do something else. But on some level, it is dishonest to tell our kids you can be anything and do anything you want, because there are some things you couldn't. Like I literally could not be a pilot even though I wanted to. Now, having said how I see myself driving since, it's probably good I didn't fly a plane, but whatever.
Jamie, what's your take on that? No.
And so I just want to talk a little bit as we launch this topic about letting our feelings trump reality sometimes. So I'm going to make some statements. I got a series of statements here, and I want you to think of it like a parent. If your kid came to you with these statements, how would you react? So let's say your kid said, "I feel like I don't matter. That's what I feel like." How would you respond to them?
Well, my first question would be, why do you feel that way?
Mhm.
Obviously. And then I'm sure I would take the conversation in the direction of why they do matter,
Why they do
because
matter.
of who created them.
Well, more than that. I mean, okay.
We'll just be brief because it's going to go all night.
Yeah, it can't be more than that, but obviously, like, why they matter.
Well, because, of who they are and
Yeah,
their
who they
family
are.
and who they,
Yeah.
and how they can know that they matter.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
all those
and
things. All right.
and whether they matter or not is not based on how
How
they
you
feel
feel
about
that
it,
day.
right?
Exactly.
Mhm.
What if they said, "I feel unloved"?
It'd be the same conversation.
Something similar.
We'd show
Yeah.
them how they are loved.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say you're a prosecution lawyer. So let's get out of the parent mode. You're a prosecution lawyer, and you
Guilty.
have a suspect that you can prove is guilty, and they say, I feel like I'm innocent. How would you respond to that?
The evidence
But I
says
feel
otherwise.
innocent. Yeah. Okay, let's say you're a doctor, and you have a patient that comes to you, and it's like super hot outside, and they show up saying, but I feel freezing. I'm freezing. I'm super cold.
Well, then we need to run some tests.
Right. Maybe you're running a fever.
Look into why.
Because
Yeah.
I believe you that you feel like that, but you shouldn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
then there are
kinda
some things
cute
in our
right there.
culture where we are now affirming feelings, right?
Oh, yeah. I
When
can
they
feel
are out of touch with reality.
I can feel the
right?
heat from the torches outside the window already.
Yeah. So there are some things that culture and media and celebrities and even education nowadays is saying, if that's how you feel, then that's reality, right? And I want to talk a little bit about that today. And before we get into like the nitty gritty, which I think we will, and we're going to eventually pivot to like how we have these conversations with our kids. It's a topic, and it's a movement, and it's a conversation and culture that we can either ignore or we can talk about it, right? So we're going to have a conversation about gender today and how many different genders there are and how we know how many there are and how we respond to that and how we've come to a consensus, or how do we come to consensus of what we believe about that before we can even teach our kids about that and pass that down. So if I were to just ask you guys how many genders are there, what would your responses be to that?
2,
And what are they?
male and female.
And how do we know that there's only 2?
Because God created male and female.
And not to mention the science that everybody wants us to believe also
Yeah.
confirms.
And there are very discerning parts.
Right?
When a child is born, you can tell if they are male or female.
even
Right.
before they're born.
Specifically.
Right, even before they're born.
Yes.
And if you, let's say you just decided, and I did today, to just Google from let's say a gender identity affirming type position on this, how many genders there are. Nobody even wants to take a stance and throw out a number. They all say things like there's an infinite amount, or there's more and more every day, or there's an unlimited number, or we don't even know how many genders, because everyone's afraid that they'll be canceled tomorrow if they say 17 and it comes into 18 tomorrow, right? And so that's
we're
kind of
way
the
past
stance on
18,
it.
don't you know?
Having said that, if you were to dig up our bones in 25 years, we're only going to see 2 genders, right? There's only going to be 2. We're not going to know how many we identified with. Jim's actually looking stuff up right now.
Yeah. So I just Googled this. How many
Okay.
genders are there? And the number one response comes from teentalk.california.
Okay.
On gender identity, it says there are many different gender identities, including male, female, transgender, gender neutral, non-binary, agender, pangender, genderqueer, two-spirit, third gender, and all, none, or a combination of these.
How can you be all none or a combo of all or none?
What's two-spirit?
Haven't you seen Hot Rod where he's like, house cat is my spirit animal? That used to be a joke. It's serious now, Jim. It's serious.
Oh,
Okay,
man.
so
Okay.
they sent us some paperwork for my son because he had a medical condition, and because he was adopted, he's covered, for certain medical issues by the state. So they sent us some paperwork, and instead of like the box where like is he male or female,
It's like 2
it had
pages
that
long.
box. It had that box, and it was like, was he born male or female? Then it had another box. What does he identify as? Then it had another box. What do you think of yourself as? I was like, why is there 3 different boxes for gender? And it was like, there was like so many different choices. I was like, what
Right.
the heck is going on? Like,
Right.
it
And-
was crazy.
It used to be my favorite part of a piece of paperwork to fill out because it was one of the easiest.
Yeah,
besides my
it's
name.
a definite.
to
Like,
just-
these other ones I'm going to have to think about, but this is, and I want to be careful how we approach it, because I know it's easy for us in a group of like-minded people to just sort of like be very crass and like, it maybe crass is the wrong word, but just honest and open and very deliberate. And I want to allow for the fact that there are people out there that feel like they are a different gender than they were born with. However, what we're going to talk about today is whether or not what they feel like affects reality or the other way around, right? And so I want to read you something. So this is from that same, it might have been from Teen Talk that you're talking about, but I was reading this, and this is an article from a psychologist who affirms gender identity, right? And gender identity says that it's fluid, it can be ever changing, and you can decide what your identity is or what you feel like. And it's not based on your anatomical, biological, or chromosomal makeup, right? And so this is from somebody that believes that. But then they say this. Often when people have told me things like, I feel it and that's how it is, I've given the example of red snow. Though any other example having to do with color is just as good, few people can argue about color. I tell them that the argument that they are using to tell me that they feel like something is like telling me one day that I noticed snow is red and not white because I feel like it's that way. I feel like it's red, and since I feel it, that's how it's true. And this psychologist says, obviously, everyone who hears me say this would tell me, obviously, I'm crazy. So much as I feel like snow is red, the truth is it's actually naturally white. And that was her description to get people out of delusion when they say things that aren't true based on feelings. However, she also feels like with gender, it's totally different. However you feel is...
That's what I always thought was interesting about the entire gender concept is... Every other situation is like deemed, you can talk it out, you can rationalize, but as soon as it comes to gender, you're not allowed to question, point out anything, refer to science, even though they're always telling you to refer, it's very interesting that way. It's just, why gender? Why is that the thing that, I don't know.
To me, it's like, it's no different than like, okay, so if my mother is black and my father is Asian, I can't say that I'm white. Like, I'm half.
Can you say you feel white?
Black. I could want to be white. I can pretend to be white, but I will never be white because
but you can say you
I
feel
am
white.
Half black and half Asian. That is just the way that my genetics are.
And even if
I
you got to the
can't
point where you
change
say
that.
you feel white, and I believe you that you feel white, you're still not. Right.
Okay. However I feel about that, I might not want to be black, I might not want to be Asian, but that doesn't change the genetic makeup of who I am. And I cannot say I'm white and that changes who I am. Like you cannot just change who you are based on how you feel, like genetically.
I think
so.
What I get confused with is how do you know what that thing, color, gender feels like anyway? Like,
right.
how do you...
And all of us as teenagers, okay, everyone as a teenager experiences like a who am I, a finding yourself phase, like, and if we throw that gender thing in there for them to confuse them more, I just feel like that creates more of a problem because we all are trying to find who we are. Okay. Sure. And if we make that an even bigger question, like, okay, are you even a boy or a girl? Like, that's another thing they have to explore and try to find. And that's not even their fault. Now that we've made it an open discussion, like, you can be whatever you want. Like,
and
that's
there's a
even more
certain
confusing.
sense of like trendiness and like phases, and it's kind of cool to be different than, you're not going to let them pin you down by just two. There's a certain sense of that kind of thing going on right now in schools where it's like, well, I want to be different and I want to, at the same time, I want to talk about who we are. Like, if our identity doesn't come from how we feel about or what gender we feel like where our identity should come from, I want to talk about that in the sense of what we think and what we're going to pass on to our kids. And we'll definitely get into that because there's a biblical perspective on that.
So the website that I was reading says that it wasn't until European colonists came over and brought along homophobia and transphobia.
Mm-hmm. And before that, there were multiple genders, right?
Right. Yeah. And so they said, well, these cultures, were cultures before that we were, open to those things, and they believed and knew that there were more than two genders. Mm-hmm. And so I Googled, okay, what are six cultures what are cultures that believed in this? So they popped up with, I guess it's Britannica, so it may be related to the encyclopedia. Mm-hmm. And they bring up six cultures, and but the problem is that none of it really explains how that level of acceptance within the cultures that surrounded those people were. It just says that they did it. It doesn't mean that it was an accepted practice or a prevalent thought or this was totally normal. Yeah. Some of them are given roles and titles, but okay, just because they did it, just because a man robbed a bank doesn't mean that was an accepted practice, right?
And it gets fuzzy because the same the same movement or the same culture that'll say, I was born a male, but I don't feel like a male. I feel like a female trapped in a male's body. If you were to ask them, okay, well, what traits are female? What does it mean to be a female? I mean, there's a whole what is a woman type thing, right? That Matt Walsh did. But what does that mean? What's the female part that you feel? They can't answer that, right? So it's like, well, then how do you know that you feel like a female if you don't know what that is? Right. How do you know you don't feel like a male if you don't know this? So I have a couple questions. So number one, if you look at, say, transgenderism, right? Those are people that feel like a different gender than what their anatomy says. It's like 95% males that feel like a woman trapped in a male's body, not the other way around. Right. And I always question, like, well, why is it then? If half of us are trapped in the wrong body, why does it feel like it's only going one direction, right? And there's a whole lot of reasons for that I could, like, speculate on. I mean, I think there's a perversion going on where it's like, if I say this or this or this, I get access to locker rooms, that kind of thing. There's that kind of gross thing going on. There's also the fact that in culture nowadays, I feel like there's some advantages to being female, and people are pushing into that, right?
Sure.
And so it's just, I always find that interesting. Like, if we all are trapped, or half of us are trapped, or whatever it is, why does it seem like it's only going one direction? Like, there's a whole bunch of women that are trapped in male's body, not the other way around.
It's ironic.
You got the whole sports thing going on.
I remember growing up, on a little bit of a lighter note, my dad, I would, like, complain about something womanly, or my mom would and something, and he would be like, "Thank you, Lord, that I'm a man." And he would just move on. It was like his running joke all the time. And now we have this culture, and I'm like, it's so confusing.
Right.
Yeah.
But.
And so to think about it in terms of our kids, and we'll pivot in a second. Like, let's just talk about where should we get our identity from, and what does that look like?
Sure.
And how we even teach that to our kids. So where should we be looking for our identity, do you think?
Well, I think obviously we talked about this in previous episodes, but the majority of that, if not all of it, starts on that foundation, right? What is the foundation that you are building your perception of reality on, your worldview, right? And we have to say that, like, if it's not solid, if it's flexible, if it's all these things, it opens up a door to, what's the word I'm looking for? Was it relevant? Is it relevant truth? What am I thinking of?
Reality? I don't know.
No, there's universal truth, and then there's relevant truth. It is relevant truth. So you're opening up the door to relevant truth, so that truth is, there is no truth. It's contradictory. It's a contradictory statement, right? Like, Relative. There you go. Jeez.
Sorry, I zoned out for a second.
Yeah.
I didn't know exactly where you're going.
Relative truth.
Relative truth.
Okay.
Right.
So you open up the door to relative truth, and it's a contradictory statement in and of itself. If a truth is relative, then it cannot be truth, right? It is flexible. It's always changing. It's always by whatever it is.
So relative truth would be, you have a truth that's different, or it may even, like, counteract what I think is true.
Exactly.
Right?
It's a little bit oxymoronic. Huh?
Yeah.
Right. But then that means that there's no standard for anything to be held to, right? And everybody who maybe has that kind of perception of life, they probably celebrate that, I imagine, because it allows them to do whatever they want.
Right.
But the problem is that when those things crumble, that they tend to soak their entire identity into, their whole life falls apart, right?
Right.
So you don't have anything stable to grow on, to build on.
Right.
There's nothing to come back to once those things
For sure.
Well, yeah,
fall
and
apart.
I've seen these people that, claim these identities, and they'll talk about their story, and they'll be like, "Well, I used to call myself this, but now I'm going by this," and like they can't even settle on one, but they're so set, quote unquote, on their identity, and it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But back to your question. Sorry,
It's all right.
I know. Go ahead.
So yeah, that's where I would say we'd have to start. You have to start with any child if you're going to, try and raise them up to be a stable person. And good, bad, whatever, people want to label it, whatever, but let's just go to stable, right? There has to be a foundation. It's like a house, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like a house. You build it on sand, it's going to fall away.
Right.
You build it on rock or concrete, and it's going to be stable. You can continue to build. You can continue to grow.
Right. There's got to be some absolutes.
Right.
Like
And
the fatal flaw in universal, is that what it was? Relative
Relative.
truth is that people would say, well, there isn't a truth for everybody. Everybody can have their own truth. But if that statement, everyone can have their own truth, isn't an absolute truth, then the whole thing breaks down, right? Because you're making a statement, and if that's not always true, then your whole thing breaks down. Right. So there is absolute truth, so you kind of get to that point. But
I remember, once again, to answer your question, for me, and we've stated this a few times on this podcast, obviously to teach our kids scripture, teach them what God says about them. We just started this morning a Bible in a, relative year, Bible in a year, chronological anyway, just to give the kids that, set foundation.
So a biblical perspective on identity kind of starts like when you're born, right? You're created as one or the other genders, right? And to imply any differently would be implying that God somehow made an error. Right. And the same thing happens with like pro-choice, pro-life arguments where people want to take the periphery and say, well, what about rape? This 1%, let's frame the whole argument. The same people do the same with this, where they say, what about intersex, right? What about people born with two? But they still are male or female chromosomally, and they can still tell. So we can't frame the whole argument based on that. But in 99% of the cases, you're born male or female.
Percentage-wise, yeah, statistically, the numbers
and to
far
say
out.
that you feel like you're stuck in one or the other
anomalies
would imply that God was in error. Right. And so...
Right.
Yeah, and scientifically, just like any other, I'm studying medical terminology right now for a potential future job, and the word disorder has come up more times than I can count, and the point of that is doctors are treating things that are out of order, which implies an order, a foundational order or process of things, and then you go to the doctor if something is out of order. So just like the intersex, you know what I mean? We had a friend whose daughter was born with some issues, and the doctors told them they might have to make some decisions to help her be normal in life. And I just want to keep that really light here, but it ended up resolving itself and whatnot. But the point is, regardless, those decisions being made doesn't foundationally change that person's identity. You know what I mean? Right. And then there was a reason that there needed to be intervention because something was out of order, right? And it wasn't based on how the baby felt either, right? It was based on objective, results in an office, So
and like we said at the beginning, those statements that we shared at the beginning, we talked about how your feelings don't trump reality, right? And in so many instances, we were fine with that, saying that. And then when it comes to this one, this is where it gets kind of gray, where people think, well, it's okay. What's the harm in letting them feel like they're something other than what they are or whatever? And so how could we deal the difference between a phase or a time period where you might feel like you have more masculine traits or you might feel like you have more feminine traits? How do we separate that from somebody actually genuinely confused about, do I have the wrong body parts for what I feel like?
Well, can I say from my perspective, okay, each person has a choice whether to choose, whether they want to follow God or they want to choose, other things, right? I think God brings us to a place of discomfort with ourselves. And each one of us has to deal with that on our own basis. I'm sinful. I'm not, good enough. And some people move forward in that same attitude, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. And so I need to make changes to myself. And so they adjust something. They can adjust their gender. They can adjust their lifestyle. They can adjust, their personality. They can choose to adjust something to make themselves feel more comfortable. But I think God brings us to that place of discomfort so that we can realize that we need Him in our lives. And when we come to that place, we can choose to invite Him into our lives and, adjust that way, or we can choose to move forward without Him and try to adjust ourselves. And I think that's an uncomfortable way to adjust yourself. You have to make huge changes to make yourself feel like you're okay.
Right.
Because we're not okay. We're all sinful and we need God in our lives. And when He comes to you and He says, make your choice, we have a choice. We can choose ourselves or we can choose Him.
So let me try to summarize what you're saying. It sounds like you're saying like at some point we may all come to realization that like something about me doesn't feel right.
Right.
Right. But when people take that to the step of like, let me alter my appearance or my actual
Yes.
expression of gender, that's a little bit of a jump.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, first of all, I really like the way that you put that, because it's kind of a common thing for a believer, a Christian, to say things like, well, I was trying to fill that hole in my heart with anything else, right? Like, and then I found Jesus and it filled that hole. So it's a common thing. But the way that you framed it now is in reference to what we're seeing today, and I think that's probably the first time I've looked at it like that. If these people really, if everyone knows there's something wrong with me, right? We know that that's intrinsically, that's just there, and it's sin, right? We're born into it. So I really like that. I would have to say, though, statistically, young people of this generation are the least exposed to Christianity or to that belief system to begin with. So if you don't have that belief system to begin with, if you're never exposed to it and the world is just willy-nilly, I can only imagine how confusing life would be in general, know, especially with the messages that are being sent out there daily. So I guess I would have a little bit of compassion for them in that, from that point of view, because maybe they didn't have parents who exposed them to it.
So I think the difference between saying, yeah, there's something wrong with you, there's something wrong with all of us. I know the cure, his name is Jesus. The world has been, there's nothing wrong with you. Oh, but here's a whole bunch of ways to fix it.
Right.
Like, how does that happen? How does that work?
Right.
There's nothing wrong with you. Your feelings are valid, but you need to go do this, this, and this.
Which brings me to my second point.
Oh.
Sorry. Which was, so the other thing I wanted to say is that it's interesting to me that as a people, we have found a way to soak up our entire identity in terms of male or female or not, right? Or gender, right? It's based on that, or sexuality, or whatever it is. That is who you are now, suddenly. That's everything about you. You can't be a fighter and bold and tough and be a woman. Like, you can't do those things. That's oh no, you're definitely a man in a woman's body. That's ridiculous. You know what I mean? People are limiting themselves by needing to attach a label to everything, right? And that's what we're seeing. So if we're talking,
even if the label is unlabeled.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm unlabeled.
Exactly.
Is what I am. Yeah.
I'm multi-labeled.
Right. I'm both labeled and non-labeled.
Yeah.
Currently.
I'm too labeled. Yeah.
So to pivot a little bit, the short answer to what we're talking about is your identity should be found in your Creator, and you should be able to rest in that. And then past that, like, it gets a little blurry. But if we're to pivot a little bit and talk about how we would have these conversations with our kids, there was a point when we started the podcast that I thought we would have to have a segment on, like, proving that schools are pushing this. I think we're past that. I think if you took 10 seconds and Googled it and then came to the conclusion that, like, schools aren't pushing it, I think you have a viewpoint that you're not willing to change. So you may get to the point where you're like, they are pushing it and I agree with it. Okay. But for somebody to argue like, no, schools are kind of shying away from this is absolutely bogus. Yeah. It's out there. And so it is something we're going to have to confront. I know the two couples represented here both homeschool, so we may have to confront it in a different manner, and it may not look like going to a school board meeting and raising Cain like some of these parents are having to do. But we're still going to have to confront these conversations, right? And I'll just tell you the approach that happened the other day when the kids are asking me about, and I don't know if you were in the car or not, about different genders and all that kind of stuff. Because there's a character on one of their video games that said non-binary or something. So I was kind of trying to explain that to a little bit. And we had a little bit of a discussion, and I was telling them that, like, there are certain movements that celebrities are pushing, right? They're affirming, and they're saying, I stand for this and I stand for that. Then there's culture pushing their own agenda, whether or not that's in tune with celebrities. A lot of times it is. And then there's what mom and dad would tell you, and then there's what Scripture would tell you. And I was asking them, which one of those four, or which ones of those four do you think would be more reliable to find truth? Would it be a celebrity who's trying to sell you something? I want you to come to my concert. I want you to see my movie. Would it be the culture, or would it be mom and dad, or would it be the Bible? And we kind of had that conversation because I feel like there's only a couple of those answers that would have your best interest in mind, right? and yet young people so often look to like people on Twitter and people on TikTok and celebrities and the culture for truth, and then are surprised when they find out that it wasn't truth. And I don't think we should be that shocked for that. What do you guys think about that?
I don't know what like what to say. I feel like you said it all. You know what I mean? Like what can you say about that? If your kids can come to the conclusion of what's going to be in the best interest, who is going to have their best interest at heart, right? Then they're probably on the right path already. You know. If we were to discuss why this is an important topic of conversation with your children, I think that's easy to come up with so many reasons, right? Like because the ideology is becoming pervasive to culture in general. So what we're seeing with trans athletes and women's sports and things like that. We have a daughter. I don't want her to go on to the jiu-jitsu mat and get slammed around or whatever by a guy or whatever I self-identify as, but a guy who's 2 times bigger than her and whatever because, I feel like I'm a woman today. We've already seen it just biologically, they're bigger, you know, there's advantages to that size-wise and everything. I'm not saying that she couldn't whoop a guy, like, at some point, yes.
Yeah.
But it's just not going to happen, just like with the swimming and all these other things that are happening. It can have a serious effect on your children and their own self-esteem, their own thought process. Like, I'll never be as good as that person because they are biologically stronger,
right.
All these different things. So why even bother trying?
And the culture will tell you that this isn't possible, what I'm about to describe. But I believe it's possible that you're pro your daughter and not anti somebody else. Right?
Yes.
Being pro your daughter doesn't automatically mean you hate somebody else or you hate a certain group.
Exactly.
You're just sticking up for a group that's
right.
Nobody seems to be sticking up for. Right?
Well, tangent possibly in the light of daughters and stuff. But like, one thing we're seeing is, you know, the culture. Jim and I were just talking about this actually. Like, when you stand on scripture, it doesn't change. Truth is truth, and it doesn't change. It doesn't shift. So you can always come back to it, and that's your safe, solid ground. But the culture and what's appropriate today, or what everybody's fighting for today, is going to be different next year. It just is. So a few years ago, it was believe all women.
Right.
If they felt unsafe, if they were accusing someone of certain acts, things like that, you're going to believe them regardless. Now, biological women are saying they feel uncomfortable when biological men are invading their spaces. They have to shut up now. So it's very confusing, and it's very, hypocritical.
Right.
So because you can't, culture goes through phases.
Right.
Yep.
The bar keeps moving.
Yes.
And the next bar move may contradict this current
the previous
bar move.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it could really jeopardize the safety of your children in their own
And you
lives
don't give
later on.
anyone a place to stand on, because you're literally setting up people for failure, whether it's the transgender person in the results of their surgeries or socially even, or it's their potential employers and places that are going to get in trouble for using the wrong pronoun.
Right.
Now you're literally
Right.
complicating everybody's life.
Not remodeling the entire store so they can have a non-gender
Right.
bathroom or whatever.
And there's 2 groups that don't exist if you listen to media. People that have transitioned and are upset about it and wish they can go back, and that you know, those people don't exist, which
Right.
it only takes you a few seconds, you find a ton of them. And women, actual biological women that don't want this pushback or
Right.
push into of like men taking over their sports or men being told they're woman of the year when they were
Right.
born anatomically.
And it's
those,
funny.
Those 2 groups of people don't exist.
It's funny when those people are still quote unquote allies to the rest of them, right? Like
right.
J.K. Rowling.
And by staying quiet,
is a
you're
huge,
kind of an ally.
right? J.K. Rowling's a huge example for that, right? She's total pro-feminism, all these different things, but she doesn't agree with the trans movement, what's going on, and she says it, and what happens? They tried to dox her, right? They're trying to ruin her. So that bar keeps moving, the goalposts keep moving. Me personally, I can't see this lasting. This is going to go away. Like, it's going to get to a point of utter insanity.
You know,
and somebody, like, we're already seeing that. We're just talking about that, right?
I could see there being a trendy pushback on it, and that will embolden, I think, the people that have a genuine pushback on it. At the same time, when's the last bar move that disappeared?
Right.
I can't think of one.
Yeah.
It's a slippery slope, and we kind of just keep going further. I think a myth that people run into, especially people that are Christian, is they feel like Because you hear non-Christians say all the time, the Bible was relevant maybe for another time, but it's not anymore. And then Christians feel like, well, there's really nothing scripturally to tell us how to respond to this. But this whole like confusion over sexuality and gender is not new. Like it's all over the Old Testament.
Right.
It's not like God's not ready for it. God's surprised by it. God's intimidated by it. God's not like, didn't expect it to get to this point. If you read some scripture, like this has been happening. It may be happening in a different form. It may be more, like you said, more pervasive, more upfront. I was reading a stat the other day that said 1 in 5 millennials identify as a gender other than what they were born with. And I just wonder, of those 1 in 5s, how many actually feel confused and how many are like, well, if all my friends do, I guess I do too. And it's kind of like I don't want to be on the other side and get canceled. So I'm curious about that. But go ahead.
I was going to say, in that regard, like you said, God told us in Scripture, it's pretty clear. Shouldn't have to say it again. Just like as a parent, if I tell you no, candy is not a suitable breakfast, I shouldn't have to tell you that every day. And you shouldn't ask me. Not that my kids ask me for candy, just to let you know. But anyway, there's some questions that are answered. You just don't like the answer, so you keep on trying to get a different answer.
So I would have to ask on that same, this kind of relates, I guess, in a little bit to the last conversation that we had, is as a parent, now your child says, I feel like I'm the wrong gender.
Right.
How do we approach that? Do we set boundaries and say, nope, I'm sorry you feel that way, but that's not right. Like, just go look in the mirror. Or do we try to reason with them through that? Like, how do we approach that?
And ask them why. Yeah. Like, make them give evidence, because if they can't even formulate the why, they can't even define what it means to be male or female, then it's easier to reason with them at that age where they're genuinely coming to you for an answer, for you to kind of get them back on track, right? Yeah.
If they're coming at that age. But if you have the teenager who is...
We'll still ask them why. Like,
sure.
If they're coming to you to tell you that, then I would hope that they'd be open to some discussion at the very least.
I have a hard time envisioning that. I feel like if the teenagers come in and telling you that, it's for shock factor to the parents. I mean, typically, unless you have that established relationship where
it's hard for me to picture that conversation regardless with our kids, A, because they're not teenagers yet, and B, they still seem so innocent and naive. Like, so it's kind of hard to even know exactly.
But it's being normalized, right? I mean, it's in every movie out there now.
Sure.
It's
it's a requirement.
It's being normalized. It's being pushed younger and stuff.
Even in preschool
it's not
shows.
something we can just ignore and say, our kids will never deal with this. If they don't deal with it themselves, they're going to know someone that does and stuff. Yeah. And I feel like, so there's a term out there called gender affirming care that schools want to offer now that drives me nuts, because it's basically you're affirming something that's not real. It's, and I feel like as a parent, we should affirm reality. Right? I don't want to. I want to hear their feelings. I want to validate the fact that I hear them, not the fact that their feelings
or that
alter
you
reality.
Feel that way,
right? So I feel like you have to hear them. At the same time, if we're going to validate anything, it should be reality and not and then just walk them through that. Hey, in other aspects of your life where you feel certain things, that doesn't change.
Right.
What is or isn't, right? And so why on this one issue can we say, well, based on how you feel, that's how everybody else should have to alter the way that they treat you? If you're a woman, right, a biological woman, and you say, I feel pregnant, right, and you're not going to have a baby in 9 months. Right. And I've even heard somebody who stands on the other side of the fence that was an EMS. I don't know if you see this interview.
I have.
And the speaker says, if you were treating a patient that was a male patient, but they said they identify as a woman, and they were in pain, would you check them for how did he describe it?
Pregnancy.
Yeah, would you check to make sure they weren't having like a miscarriage? And there was a pause, and he was like, well, no. And he's like, well, then what? The way that somebody feels about something doesn't alter their gender. Right. It might alter how they feel like they should be, but it doesn't change reality.
I remember years ago, I had an acquaintance. She wasn't really a friend, but I had an acquaintance, and she had texted a friend of mine who I was with a picture of it was an ovulation test, and it just showed that she had ovulated, right? So it said positive, quote unquote, and she sent it as an announcement that she was pregnant. Oh. And well, she was a little aloof, but my friend was like, "That's not a pregnancy test. That's an ovulation test." She's like, "Well, it's a pregnancy test to me." That's literally what she said. When she was in her 20s, and I'm like,
that makes no sense.
What does that accomplish? Like what, so like you just said, in 9 months when you don't have a baby, what, it's strange. It's like, how do you, don't get me wrong, you can have feelings, frustrations, you can be in a fight with your spouse and feel like you're totally right and then get clarity later. You can have, things happen where our perspective is skewed. But there's a point where you have to be in touch with reality and you have to like have that paradigm shift and then you move forward in the right direction.
Yeah.
But if everybody was just constantly affirming your delusions in any other area, like you have the right to steal any wallet that you see lying on a table.
Sure.
If a person feels that way, are you going to affirm that?
No. And we don't. And even people on the other side of the fence on this topic, like let's say we had a presidential candidate and they dug into his past and they found a video of him dropping the N-word a bunch of times and he says, he or she says, I don't feel like I'm racist. They wouldn't accept that. Mm-hmm. They would just look at the reality and say you either are or you aren't, or based on what we see.
If we take fact and we make it, we try to disguise it as opinion, we end up on a slippery slope. Like, if you're going to say, okay, you can choose your gender based on how you feel, okay, when do you stop that? Like, when does it become okay or not okay to be an adult male who is attracted to children?
Or adult
we
female
can say that's I'm attracted to children. That's just how I feel.
What about
why couldn't you say I feel like I'm also a child, so it's not weird for me to be attracted to children?
How can we say that's not okay, but yet you can choose, based on how you feel, you can choose your gender, but you can't choose to be attracted to children, or you can't choose your race. We talk about racial appropriation or whatever as being not okay in society.
But I feel that way.
Okay, but how is gender appropriation?
How is a man changing their appearance to look like a woman not the same thing as like blackface?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Why is it not offensive in the same way?
It's, you are what you are, and there is
Shouldn't
fact,
that be offensive to real
is
females in the way that it would be offensive to real?
I would think
people
so.
of color?
I mean,
And
blackface
it
is
is
a
too
caricature
many of
of a
them.
person, right?
Yeah.
And to some,
Well-
being transgender is like what they want their whole life to be.
Right.
There are some people out there who I think are
Actors
doing it as a caricature.
Sure.
Dylan Mulvaney is
Sure.
huge.
Sure.
The first one that comes to mind for me.
Well, yeah, he, his first little, just for a quick moment, his first little video, day one of being a girl, and he talks about literally these negative 4 points that he claimed. Like,
pride.
and a lot of women did come out and they're like, you are making us to be weak, emotionally unstable, like da da da. We have our moments, but anyway, like, what is that nonsense? And why would you desire to be those things that you just listed?
Right.
Mhm.
It doesn't make any sense. Like, it's very, and then to find out he has an actor background, how does anybody take him seriously? That's what I don't understand. And then these people are being placed on a pedestal and given tons of money to keep going.
Right.
So, which does not provide for an easier way to be convicted of the truth to move away when money's there as well.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, and we talked about that before. You're showing your kids, here's what it looks like to be successful, but they look out into a culture that almost looks like when you make poor choices, you get success.
More success, yeah.
Right.
So again, like, just to ask the same question again, like, how do we tackle this topic with our kids?
we need to. I've had this discussion with
Are we
them.
proactive
Our
or are we
feelings,
reactive?
Both.
our feelings are not, the be all and end all of every situation. Like, we don't need to follow our feelings. Sometimes our feelings are bigger than our situation, and sometimes
It's okay to have
we
them,
need to.
but sometimes
okay,
they're wrong.
Yeah, sometimes we overreact, and sometimes we are too upset about something that we should not be that upset about. And there's validating feelings, and then there's there's just accepting whatever. But, as teenagers, obviously there's hormones that come into play, and things feel very serious
Sure.
when they're not that serious.
Sure. And peer pressure.
And we need to
and
bring them
cultural pressure
back down to
factors in.
earth and help them realize, things are not as serious as they seem.
Yeah.
And we need to, measure our reactions to things. I've heard my daughter scream bloody murder because her brother changed something on one of her Lego figures. Like, really? Because that's not that big a deal. Like, okay, you can say, hey, I don't like when you do that. You don't need to scream.
Or even better,
like
go
you're
change
dying.
one of his Legos. I'm just kidding.
Oh, gosh.
Right?
But I think if you start young and be consistent about the fact that I hear your feeling. Like when kids say, but I need this, some toy and I need it. And you're like, I understand you think you need it, but you're wrong. It's not something you need, right?
Yeah, you can
may
acknowledge.
want it and you can enjoy it, but you don't need it, right?
Make them feel heard
Sure.
so they don't. We
Yeah.
said this, I think, one of our first couple episodes. Like,
Sure.
make them feel heard and understood, but your job is still to guide in the right direction.
Sure.
And once you feel acknowledged, you can trust your parent more to give you the truth. But if you're constantly pushing them aside, never validating their feelings, always saying that because I said so's, blah, 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 then of course this big old solution, quote unquote, that the world's offering seems like the big ticket, right? So.
Sure.
Yeah. Our feelings need to be validated, but also measured.
Ooh, yes. I like
Yeah.
that.
So, there's extremes that need to be called into, account that.
Yeah, it's hard. I have a hard time with the word validation because if I say I validate your feelings, like if you look up the definition of validation, that would say I hear your feelings and I agree that they're true. And that's not what we mean when we say
Right.
validate. We're saying
Like
I understand that you really feel that way and really believe that way,
Right.
but I'm not also in agreement that those feelings are reality.
I understand that
Yeah.
you're frustrated, but yeah. Do you need to scream? Do you need to throw things? Do you need to this? And is it that important? Like,
Let's
when
take
you're-
a step back. Let's
it's a
look at the
video
facts.
game. I understand that you're frustrated that your character died on your video game. Like, do you need to throw the controller across the room and possibly break it? Like, what is the consequences of that overreaction and things like that? Like, measure your responses based on the reality of what the situation is. Just because we feel extremely upset about something doesn't make it that big a deal in reality.
Something too, I mean, our kids are younger, obviously, but my daughter can be way more emotional and reactive than my son. And you can take it back to the golden rule, really, right? A little bit like, okay, if your brother was feeling super angry and decided to just pinch you out of nowhere, how would that make you feel? Like, would that be a solution? And obviously this is on a kid level, and that's where we're at, right? That's where our kids are at. But yeah, just once again, it's all processing through to the end. Like, let's think the whole thing out. Let's talk about steps. Let's, and then I've seen her use her words more wisely lately. Have you noticed she's been more calculated in the way she
absolutely.
talks? Like, don't get me wrong, the screaming, you made me laugh when you mentioned that story. Because, yeah, bloody murder, you come running down. It's like, he took my green pencil. And
What?
Yeah, something like that. But
Is there such a thing anymore? Like back in my time, I don't know if it makes me old, but you would have like tomboys, right? And they would say metro, which would mean a male that was like maybe not flamboyant, but a little more like in touch with some feminine traits, maybe.
Interior design.
Right. Or like maybe they dyed their hair, maybe they put a little nick in their eyebrow, maybe they had earrings. I'm describing myself,
Or
really.
shiny shirts.
Maybe they
to
liked
get some
vanilla ice.
reflection in.
Maybe they also wore dress pants. Anyways.
Jamie, is that trauma for you? Because you've mentioned
Right?
the shiny
Is
shirt
there-
on quite a few.
Does our culture allow for that? Because I almost feel like they're like, oh, you want to do a couple like more traditional male things, and you're probably a boy, and like.
So I was gonna, I don't know if you're gonna, that was close. Ask a question that leads to this answer, but I was a tomboy. Like, I did the dirt bike riding, Hot Wheels. I hated Barbies, like all that stuff. I had grandparents that still tried to buy me the girly stuff. I just wasn't into that. Like, I barely, like, this year tried practicing makeup on a somewhat kind of sort of regular basis. Like, I'm just not into that stuff. But never, not once, like, was I asked if I was really meant to be a boy or.
Did you ever
any of
feel
those
like
things.
you were? Did it ever like cross
Actually,
over?
yeah,
Okay.
like it did cross my mind,
Okay.
but it obviously didn't go anywhere, and I didn't ask anybody about it. I just
Okay.
kind of moved on with life, like, you know what I mean? But I know for an absolute fact my parents would not have affirmed anything in
Right.
that direction, nor nor I grew up, in a Mormon household. My grandparents were very much into that. So there was something there still holding me back anyway. But
so wait, but in the midst of that questioning phase,
yeah.
if some teacher had come to you and said,
I won't tell your parents.
maybe you are a boy, maybe you should be a boy, that
Don't
might
fight
have
this
pushed
feeling.
you in the direction.
Because I think I was in that moment, I was still very much like, let people live their lives. And I was completely fine with the idea of a woman acting like a man, like not needing to be
tomboys were an okay thing back then.
like
it's
it
not
was
like that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's funny, we live in a non-binary culture at the moment, yet there has to be these clear definitions to where surgery is required. So it's very confusing. But yeah, so I just fit into the role of tomboy. That was all.
Mm-hmm.
And but just encourage that. Just let your kid, like my daughter's very artistic and very girly. That's actually kind of hard for me to quote unquote affirm, but I'm letting her
relate to.
Thanks. But like that's who she is. She's artistic. So I'm showing her ways that she can carry that out in a way that is either neutral or God honoring or, makes her, empowers her. Just today she tried to sell her grandma an art piece. Like, you know what I mean? Like very cute stuff like that. And that's okay. Just let that keep on going. Like, I just don't understand why you can't just allow your kids to have their likes, have their dislikes. And then if something questionable arises, you work it out like any other thing that's questionable. Because as we discussed in our last episode, kids don't make the best decisions a lot of the time.
No.
Period. That's about the end of that.
Yeah, I mean, our kids are totally into Sonic, right? And there's been so many times where our kids would be like, would you rather fly or run like a hedgehog? I want to be a hedgehog. I'm pretty sure I want to be a hedgehog because I want to run as fast. And they'll even like run around like if they're Sonic with their arms behind them and stuff. But that doesn't mean they're a hedgehog trapped in a male or female body. But we're only one step away from that, right? And I know that there are podcasts that are saying if you feel like a hedgehog, you're probably a hedgehog trapped in a, and we kind of giggle, right? But they're already, it's already.
Weren't they putting litter boxes in that?
Yeah, so the school district in our area actually had a meeting to decide whether or not they should have a litter box area.
Why do we make laws that say that you can't drive until a certain age, or you can't vote until a certain age, or you can't drink until a certain age?
Who cleans that litter box?
I don't know.
That's what I want to know.
If I was a janitor, I'd be like, I don't define myself as a litter box.
Why, as a society, do we agree that certain people are not
And how come some are standing up and some are squatting if there's no such thing as male or female?
I want to hear Jamie's question.
Sorry, go ahead.
She's giving you the death look.
Why do we, as a society, say that people are not ready to make certain decisions until a certain age? Like, they're not ready to drive until they're a certain age. Okay, so my 10-year-old says, I think I'm ready to drive. I'm not going to go, okay, fine, here's your driver's license, go ahead, right? Because I know that he's 10 or she's 10 and they're not going to make the best choices at that age.
Sure.
Their brains are not developed to a certain point. They're not going to make the best decisions. They're not going to have the coordination, whatever.
They still believe in Santa Claus?
Why do we, as a society, say, okay, you can't drive until this age. You can't vote until this age. You can't drink until this age.
Can't own a firearm.
You are not an adult until this age. But yet, we say that when a child is 10, they can decide if they're a male, or a female, or
10 is like
whatever,
late for what they're
or
pushing.
They can make those choices, but they can't decide whether they think the president is a good they can't vote for the right president, they can't drive, they can't make adult decisions, but yet they can make life-altering decisions before they're an adult.
I heard an
that
example
makes no sense.
The other day about like women in their 20s, if they want to go get their tubes tied, their doctors will say, no, we'd like to wait till you're in your 30s because that might be a decision that you're going to regret.
Right.
And now you have guys going, can you put some tubes in? Then we can tie them. And then
we understand that people are not... Life experience helps us understand things better, right? As a child, you don't understand everything. Every child questions who they are, and they're trying to decide who they are and stuff like that. That's a normal childhood thing. But confusing that with gender also, throwing that in there, like, okay, now you have to decide if you're a boy or a girl.
Right.
And if that's just, I think that's.
Yeah.
What's
I would say,
ironic to me is, well, I was just going to say, like, we've already talked about abortion and whatnot, and they want to essentially dehumanize the unborn children. But now they're trying to dehumanize the born children, essentially, because they're allowing, like, I'm not saying I'm for it by any means, but it'd be more understandable if it was strictly male-female. Like, people wanted to go from male to female, and that was like, or female to male. But like when you're adding in cat and unicorn and cake and onion and all these other things, like literally I've heard explanations for all of those.
Yeah. It's so, okay.
So
if you had a kid in public school, and we have to kind of guess how that would be, right? Because we don't have kids in public school. I feel like the way I probably would have a conversation with my kids would be, and if you think of it like a spouse, like if you're about to make a decision that you feel like if your spouse knew about, they would not be okay with, if you put it through that filter, it's probably a bad decision, right? And so if you're a child, and I would speak to my child this way, if you're going to make a decision and the school's going to help you make a decision, and then they say, don't tell your parents about it, I would think through that filter, no matter what that is probably not good. And I would probably tell my kids, if the school, whatever it is, it's gender, ideology, whatever it is.
Well,
if they lead with, you don't have to tell your parents about this, I would say that's probably about to be followed by something that ain't good.
Don't they teach you that for stranger danger?
Sure,
like,
yeah.
If a man in a van comes up to you and says, hey, I've got a puppy, come look at it, don't tell your parents.
Sure.
They tell you not to
Yeah.
follow with
I mean,
that.
what's the first thing you hear about, like, some kind of, like, somebody being abused is, like, they told me, don't tell your parents or this would happen or this would happen. So it's just, that would be a filter I probably would teach my kids. Like, hey, if somebody tells you, don't let your parents know. That's the first thing I want you to tell me.
There are a lot of bad parents out there.
Sure.
And there are, I think that's where they try to, confuse issues. Like, okay, well, maybe your parents are just, too strict, or they're too this, or they're too that. And they try to draw those lines, and they make kids and parents enemies, which, there are bad parents out there. I agree with that statement. There are situations where kids are in a really bad situation at home, and that's awful. But they try to expand that to all kids and say, like, your parents are not on your side. Your parents are
if
this.
you're not
your
affirming
parents are
their
that.
identity,
And so they're making kids feel like their parents are the enemy when they're not. And that's not true in every situation. So that's what's frustrating, is like, that you have parents who, love their kids to death, but they're making their kids feel like you can't tell your parents, you can't, don't talk to your parents about this. Your parents, so they're putting up walls in places where they shouldn't be.
And I think a way to combat that as a parent would be to have conversations with your kids, an open dialogue where you're like, why would anybody have your best interests at heart more than I would? Why would anybody else benefit of, like, doing what's best for you more than what I would do? And so, when they try to say, don't let your parents know this and stuff, I think it should send up some red flags with healthy parents and healthy children.
It's hard in our Plan B world. We have a personal experience with that, knowing a situation where a parent actually murdered their own child. And so, there's obvious, examples you could bring up where, like, okay, this is, really bad situation, but that's not true across the board. And so you can't use those examples like, your parents are not on your side or whatever. So, but it is hard in our Plan B world to, like, figure out where those lines are and figure out where to draw those boundaries and stuff like that. But it's
it all just comes back to foundations, and I liked your phrasing of open communication and open dialogue with the kids. Like, if you can't shelter, like, you just can't. And if you establish by acknowledging feelings that they have, not just gender related, but in general, just even our 2-year-old, if he's I know they say, don't tell your kids they're fine if they fall and hurt themselves, but I actually heard a pretty good example the other day. It was like, actually, sometimes you want them to know that because they don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're looking to you for an answer. So saying that they're fine or that they're okay or let's check you out is okay. But anyway, so starting even when they're young, acknowledging, I think, would be a good word, like that they have feelings, making sure that they know the place is safe. You hear them out when you are asking those questions. Like in our last episode, we were talking about the whys you did this or what you should do, and actually allowing them to speak as well.
Right.
Because I know sometimes we can ask those questions and then answer for them,
Yeah.
There's all those things. And then obviously we're grounded in Scripture. We're trying to make sure our kids know that the ultimate authority comes from the Lord and His foundation does not change, does not rock.
And what do we do? How do we raise kids that are bold enough to speak up when they see something wrong and have the courage? Like, I think of like Riley Gaines, right? And I keep thinking about her parents must be awesome because she just is like bold enough. You know what I'm talking about when I say Riley Gaines? She's the swimmer that should have been had all the national titles this year, but she had to race against a dude. And she, instead of just saying, okay, well, that's not what I choose for myself, she's actually been bold enough to like speak up and say what she knows to be true and stuff. Right. And I feel like it'd be cool if our kids could take it that one step further. Like not only just not get confused on what God's plan for them and how He designed them is, but also be bold enough. And I don't mean that they like start a protest in the middle of the street, but like to be bold enough and have the courage to speak up when they see something wrong, right? Instead of being silent. Like, how do we raise kids like that?
I think I noticed with our own kids, it's kind of a natural thing for our son. Like, he'll come home and say, I had this conversation with so-and-so and this and that, so I just told him this. Da, da, da. Like, he's always been that way. And so I think it's a personality thing. I don't think every kid's meant to do that. I don't think every person's meant to necessarily do that either. So I don't know if it's a good goal. How do I put it? Raise them to be confident and to never back down from truth. So if they're asked the questions, they'll ask. But I don't think every person is deemed to go be on stage on national news or anything like that. Does that make sense? What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that is a tough one, a tough hurdle, because in the case of Riley Gaines, she's already been assaulted multiple times in public. Right. You know what I mean? Like you have to worry about the physical safety of your children now. Especially in a world where, I hate to say it, but school shootings happen and all these different things, and the media will paint people as a certain way. Like, oh, this child was raised in a bigoted home, and they came out with this, and then there was retaliation, blah, blah, blah. So there's got to be that aspect that's taken into the equation. But yeah, overall, that doesn't. I mean, me personally, I feel like we should stand for truth no matter what, right? Up until the end. But I would hate to see that mean my children have to do that up until the end.
Yeah, you're in a place where you're safer to do so, right?
True.
Like,
True.
You never know where our kids will be in the future. That's the thing. Right now, but like I said,
raise them as where they'll have that mindset as an adult. That's different. You know what I mean? As an adult, I see like, okay, you are now well prepared. Hopefully, we've done a good job. Sure. And you're well prepared for this and to take care of yourself, protect yourself, whichever, and speak truth. But as a child, I find that difficult to say, okay, say it, you know what I mean? Be compassionate about it. Don't be threatening like a bully about anything, right? And I would say even as an adult, don't be that way either. But there's a balance, I think, in the kid atmosphere.
And they're also watching you, too.
Right.
If they see you in times of being cornered and needing to speak up, and you do it, I think they're going to follow like that same example.
Well,
like
go ahead. We were just talking today, like how you grew up. You've always been the stand up against the negative or stand up against the wrong doing or injustice. You've always been that way, but it took you into your adulthood and your like more, your adult experiences for you to kind of hone that in better, right?
Weird, because I see Jem as like the silent type. Just kidding.
Yeah,
just kidding.
Cricket. No, just kidding.
So do your kids have an opportunity to see you have to do that at some point?
Maybe only
not really
when we've talked about it.
I think if you were to ask them, because just like kids, they're always watching. They always are able to bring up the smallest thing that you just
I didn't know you knew that.
Yeah, I think that they would probably be able to come up with some ideas that I just didn't have. You know what I mean? Like most of us.
They're watching. I noticed my son So I always had, and it's going to sound like I'm patting myself on the back, but I want to do it more now because my son started doing it. But I always open the door for old people, or hold the door open for people and stuff. And I see my son doing it all the time now, and I'm like, that's so cool. Now I want to like, now I feel like I'm doing it out of like poor motives because I'm doing it just so he could see. But like, I noticed that he watches stuff, even stuff that you don't think about. He's seen or she's seen. They're paying attention for sure.
Like he jumps in to like, support. Like he feels like somebody says something insulting or something to me or to Mark, and he's like jumps in to defend right away. And like, it's just a really cool character that he has. But yeah, it's we got to figure out, why are they jumping on board? Are they feeling it genuinely within themselves, or are they just trying to be a part of whatever's going on around them? But
guides them to make the decision too, right? To not just follow the crowd in the culture, but to think critically before they jump on board to anything.
Right.
Thank you for listening to the Family Brew Podcast. Where can they find us at?
Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
And what should they do when they get there?
Follow us.
And what else can they do when they get there?
They can suggest new coffee flavors and suggest new ideas for new episodes, because we're going to have a new topic every week.